Welcome back to the Woven Energy Podcast on Real Practical Shamanism with me, Joseph Sikora, and Damon Smith. We are here once again, and as always, to talk about shamanism from the ground up. So this week, or this episode, we are going to have a look at the language of water. We really enjoyed our episode on the language of trees a few episodes ago, and we thought it would be really cool to do like a series on this, like the language of water, the language of fire, the language of earth, whatever it may be. So yeah, here we go, the language of water. And there's a few things we want to talk about, but first of all, Damon, we have some Patreons to thank, don't we? So
we do, mate.
Let's thank them.
We always have our awesome tribe of patrons to thank, or Patreons. We have a few new ones where we've got Brad Curtis as our most recent patron. Thanks ever so much for joining the tribe, mate. And we also, I can't remember whether we got round to thanking Stefan Stringer and Joseph Frabina just before Christmas, but thanks to you guys as well for, again, joining the tribe. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Also, I have a particular group of patrons I want to thank who did another, so just so people are aware, we do what's known as, I think, what we call the Launceston Grove. And what it is just a bit of a hastily arranged get-together for patrons based in the UK, usually the southern half of the UK, who can get to Launceston at short notice. Launceston's in Cornwall, by the way. So one of the things I was thinking is, I know for our patrons further afield in the UK and even for people overseas, if anybody's interested in joining the short notice list for the Launceston Groves, any of the patrons, you think you might be able to make one sometime, then I'll just put you on the mailing list for when so just ping me in Patreon, and I'll put you on the mailing list for when we do organize these things. We've done 3 or 4 of them now, maybe even 5. So it's just, we get together at Launceston, and usually at a weekend, and we just go and do some stuff in the woods. Might be spirit dance, might be something else. But on this particular one, on the 3rd of February, a particular group of patrons acted as guinea pigs for the new Woven Energy Spirit Dance course, the upcoming Woven Energy Spirit Dance course. We went through all of the content, which was no mean feat in a day, considering the content's supposed to be absorbed over a period of weeks. And so special thanks to Ben, Dane, Dylan, Emily, Graham, Mare, Ramby, and Robin, our awesome crew of patrons who came and helped out with that. There's some pictures of it in the Patreon members area as well. You can see the kind of, it was pretty fun. I mean, spirit dance, shamanic technique, having fun is not the point. That's not the purpose of it. But it was tremendously enjoyable, it has to be said, and I had a good time as well. So,
yeah, and it's good that you're putting this into a course. I presume it's a video course rather than an audio course.
Yeah,
and it's, the further along we get with this podcast, we always talk about it. It's an encyclopedia, you start from the beginning, all this stuff. But a lot of the techniques that we do talk about are easier understood in video format. So it should be a good addition to the Woven Energy ecosystem.
Absolutely. And I also think where we've got to in the main Woven Energy podcast episodes, we're well into level 4 now. We're talking about energy changes. We're starting to deal with energy. It gets harder and harder to talk about it on a podcast. Not that it was easy to start off with, but as you go through the stages, it gets harder and harder. So video is a lot better for this kind of thing. And as you guys know, spirit dance is kind of my forte when it comes to shamanism and things shamanic. Certainly not the only thing that I do.
So what does the course cover?
Okay, so I think we'll talk about it maybe on this one, because I think the language of water is a really, really good way of looking at spirit dance in general. So what it basically covers is, we've done a refinement. We got together a list of our favorite most of them my favorite, but other people were involved as well, favorite spirit dance techniques or favorite shamanic techniques that relate to spirit dance. And we've had a bit of, it was a very long list, it has to be said. It was a very, very long list. We've had a process of refinement that we've gone through. What we're trying to do, we've talked about this before, we're trying to pick out a group of techniques that's sufficient to support a very rich energy weave without being overpowering or just off-puttingly huge to somebody who perhaps hasn't done a lot of spirit dance before.
Yeah.
And we gradually narrowed it down to the same number that Miki pretty much, Shamness Nakayama Miki, narrowed her portfolio down to. We've got it down to 10 techniques now. And so on this episode, I'll go through them, but I'll go through them from the context of water. When you do spirit dance, we've said that you can do sort of base spirit dance, which is about creating the lower levels of it is about creating a weave. And then you use that weave to interact with a weave within nature. But in creating that weave, you want a relatively broad palette. So we've come up with 10 techniques that collectively constitute, well, A, they cover off all of the energy changes that you're ever likely to need, because each one of them has a ton of different changes in it. And B, they enable your weave to become complex enough that you could start to get some level 4, level 5 type of progress benefit from it. If you internalize them all to the point where you can do them without thinking about it, then you could do some serious, just with these 10, you could do some serious shamanic spirit dance using just these 10. The other thing is that different perspectives. So we've narrowed it down the techniques to 10 because what we wanted to do when we move on to animal spirit dance is introduce each animal in turn. And when we introduce an animal, we don't introduce a whole bunch of new techniques for that animal, as happens, for instance, in Xingyi. We introduce the same techniques, the same 10, but flavored by that particular animal. Now, unfortunately, our efforts at cutting down the huge list of animals, just my favorite animals is like there's about 40 of them or something, but we've got it down to 15 with the animals. So you want to think we've managed to cut it down to that, and we may go further. I mean, the original idea was that 10 techniques, 10 animals. That gives 10 animal flavors on each of 10 techniques. That gives you a very, very rich pool of spirit dance, and also a long-term challenge. But there's just some animals that we don't want to let go of. So it's currently 15. I don't know what we have, like a public vote or something. I don't know, but yeah. So, and I kind of understand how Xingyi ended up with 12, because you still want, whenever you practice animal spirit dance, and every time I try a new animal, I'm like, oh God, this is so enlightenment. This whichever animal it is, tiger or whatever. This is so enlightenment. You never want to let that one go. And when you've done loads of them, it's very, very hard to narrow that list down. So you want to think about this. If you think of 10 techniques across 15 animals, it's 150 things to learn. So obviously we're not going to do that. So the way the course will be structured is we introduce the 10 techniques bland, not entirely bland. It'll be flavored water flavor. That's why I'm introducing the idea on this podcast. Or what a context, what a phase, what a view on how these movements might be applied, like flowing water, like all the kind of energy changes that go on in different water contexts that we'll talk about. And then maybe the next part of the course would be, for instance, on bear, because none of the animals are easy, but bear's one of the easier ones, and it's very, very famous. Shamans the world over love bears. Bears big in Mongolia, for instance, and Siberia. And then we're thinking something relatively straightforward like snake, and then maybe swallow, and then turtle, tiger, fox, wild boar, and so the list goes on. And so and each one of those would be another course unit, another course. Do you follow what I mean? So it would end up being, even though there's only 10 techniques in there per se, it would end up being absolutely colossal amount of content. Now, the purpose of that is not to overload people. The purpose of that is really so that people can get an idea of different animals and see which ones kind of speak to them, which ones they have a natural leaning towards, which ones they might like to incorporate into their shamanic practice. So we're not expecting everybody to master 15 animals. It's we give a flavor of 15 different animals, and then it's up to the individual person which ones they take to. And as you know, different people take to different animals.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
But you need that breadth there so that you can play and experiment and find your own,
come up with your own,
find your own animal.
Yeah,
hey,
exactly.
Damon, is that the process that people think of as the spirit animal? Have you found your spirit animal?
Didn't we talk about
the deeper
this?
meaning of it? I think we did, didn't we?
We
long
talked
time
about
ago.
this, but yes, exactly. I think that's where it comes from. It's the animals that kind of speak to you. This idea that, you know, I close my eyes and I imagine that the turning lizard is coming. He's giving me some advice and all this kind of stuff. That kind of stuff grew out of the thing that some people have a natural affinity towards the energies and life patterns that some animals exhibit. And remember what we're here for. And shamanism always has a purpose. We're trying to understand ourselves in the context of nature. And therefore we seek to understand ourselves through animals that are quite closely related to us. You know, on our list of 15, there are no mantises, there are no fish, there were no, various other things that are, but there's nothing to say that people couldn't go and study those things. Just their relevance to the human condition is clearly they're further removed than monkeys and bears and things from, our
no
close
giraffes.
cousins. I'm up for putting a giraffe in, mate, for sure, but not currently on the list. Or camel either, unfortunately. But now you're mentioning them, I'm thinking maybe we'll have 20 animals or something. I don't know. But anyway, that's
there's a famous tribe in Africa that has a
right.
giraffe dance or something.
The San people, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So this is how the initial course will be the first 10 techniques, different perspectives on them, but mainly with a water kind of perspective, because that the continuousness of the weave is really, really important. And I know Christian Rosenkreutz, those that listen to the Heretics podcast, Christian Rosenkreutz, he started off with the whole fire shamanism thing. Fine. But for this, we're going to start off with the water context because it's so useful in terms of maintaining the weave, in terms of
flow,
not falling into the Tyrak. I was going to say, pitfall was my sinkhole, isn't it? It's just such an enormous pit of shamanic trappiness.
And just so people are aware, Tyrak is cutting, and so it's a repetitive movement that cuts.
Well, just cutting the stream. It's anything that cuts the stream. Yeah. So and water is so good at that because the when you see these movements in context in the water, you get the idea immediately because water just seems to be really, really good at demonstrating, even in a visual sense, how these different energy changes play out in real time. And again, on the course, we'll make reference to the level 4 episodes that we've been doing. But just to start with some examples, most people, incidentally, anybody listening to this who's new to the Woven Energy podcast, this is not a beginner's episode, but there's nothing wrong with that. Just please, the Woven Energy podcast is a linear podcast. So probably here we're episode 72 or something. We're addressing things that people who've been through all of those 72 episodes, or a large majority of them, would benefit from. That's what we're talking about. So please, if you're new to the podcast, you're very welcome. But it's best to wind back to episode 1 and start working forwards, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Otherwise, we'll be here at half of the episode. Every episode will be taken up just re-explaining everything.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's zoom out. Let's take a 100-foot view. And let me just ask you the question then. What do you mean by the language of water? You've gone into it, but 100-foot view.
What shamans do is they put themselves in a position where they take nature itself as a teacher. So normal human beings, I say normal civilized human beings, we take people as our teachers, or books or something like that. Yeah. So I go to school, I learn about different subjects. biology, chemistry, physics, usually maths and English. Everybody's crazy about those two. And, you know, it would have been nice to have been able to learn Japanese or Mongolian in school, but opportunity wasn't there. So these are things that we learn, but we learn them from people. And this is how civilized human beings have been operating for a very long time. One of the things that's created in order to help that process of learning from other people, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, is books. But because of our propensity to imagination, some of those books have become somewhat problematic in terms of, should we say, world peace and stuff like that. Well, because we have the ability to start believing things because of our need to be able to create tools, which is what makes us effective as a species. One of the things it does is we encode that in books, but the problem is we can encode anything in books. And one of the things that we encode in books is intolerance and, bigotry and various things. And I've often said, looking at, the horrendous conflicts that go on all around the world, and people say it's not about religion and faith in these books, but actually, if these people didn't have different religions from each other, how would they know who to kill? That's the thing. How would they know who to shoot? And so it is all about religion. And I think that one of the things we can do with the shamanic movement and the growth of shamanism certainly in the UK, we talked about the census and the growth of shamanism in the UK, is encourage people to look more to nature. As a teacher, it's not to say that human teachers are bad. They're really useful, and I've had quite a few myself, for shamanism included. But taken in context of nature as a teacher, you always have a kind of, I won't say it's a second opinion, it's a first opinion, right? If nature teaches you something, you can take it as authentic. You can take it as real, if you like. And unless you're one of those people that believe the world was created by the devil, that's a whole different issue. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say if you believe that. So
lots of people believe lots of things, don't they?
I know. But yeah, this podcast probably isn't going to help you very much. But when we take nature as a teacher, we can do that in different contexts. We talked about the language of trees. How can trees help us? Well, we only talked about a few things, but getting out in the forest, being bathed in the terpenes, understanding the language of the woodland, and allowing that to drive us. I mean, there's other ways in shamanic technique we've also talked about, the wind among the leaves. I think one time we talked about a technique where you take the movements of the branches in the wind of a tree and you translate them into spirit dance movement in real time. So the wind is leading the tree and the tree is leading you, and you're just like an empty vessel that's following along. That's kind of one context to look at it. There's been this thing called the 5 elements in the Far East, and there's a 5 elements model in the West as well. So the different 5 elements models, these are phases, these are ways of looking at things. And so we've covered off wood, which is the language of trees. And so on this one, we're going to do water, or the language of water. But other ones that we should probably do the language of fire. We've already addressed that big time in our Rosicrucian episodes in the theoretical sense, in our Rosicrucian episodes on the Heretics podcast. But there's also the language of earth. And if we really want to complete the set, there's the language of metal, or if you want to be a hippie, the language of crystals.
What about the language of wind?
Well, that's the other model that I mentioned. There's several 5-element models, so many. But the language of wind is very interesting because it has an awful lot in common with the language of water. An awful lot, not everything yet. So maybe this is like part 2. When we did the language of trees, we didn't intend it to be a multi-part set, but I think we could easily turn this into a multi-part set. So let me start off by giving some examples of the which, the energy with water. If you recall, a lot of our patrons, in fact, all of our patrons who get to this point in time will have at least heard of Terecht, which is this embraced position that shamans all over the world use as a foundation of many different shamanic practices, spirit dance, but many others as well, the drum. We're going to be covering the drum big time when we do our Gathering of the Tribe 2024. which I'll give a shout out for as well. Monday 13th to Sunday the 19th of May this year. And we're going to cover a lot of drum stuff on that one. Same format as last time, but instead of lots of spirit dance, it'll be lots of drum stuff. And when the embrace energy is used, it's usually used in conjunction. So Terilt in Mongolian, it's usually used in conjunction with Haftas, which is what we call the folded wings position, or folding wings, or fold wings, something like that. And these two together form a pattern that is apparent in a lot of natural water movements or natural energy changes that go on with water. You see it in waves, but it's not the waves that are breaking on the beach. It's those deep oceanic waves where the water is kind of rising and falling with a lot of power, but the movement is, it's not like a breaking wave. It's kind of rhythmic. It's heavy. It's very, very powerful. And this is why I often start off teaching these two techniques, and Haftas and Terilt. Embrace and fold wings. Doesn't really matter what you call them. It does, as you know, in shamanism, we just call them whatever you want, but 1 and 2 if you like. But the way, and a way I've noticed recently that you can see these things is quite interesting. If you get your car, if you've got a car, and you park it up at night and you're pointing towards the moon, hopefully the full moon or something like that, so you've got some moonlight coming down from above you and it's raining, when those raindrops hit the windscreen, you can see their shadows on the top of the dashboard. And those shadows, when they hit, they expand out in a almost a circle, except the windscreen's sloping a bit, so it's not a perfect circle, but in a circular outwards motion. And that is the embrace. That's the opening out, the expanding energy, still with the physical chillicity on, still with the containment on, but expanding outwards in a strong but quite gradual way. That's the embrace. But at the same time, you see a sort of black shadow in the middle of those droplets. I mean, in the reflection on the dashboard from the moon, you'll see that gradually shrink. That central point, as the outer ring expands, the central dark shadow will shrink away down to a very small point. And the great thing is you can see this, a lot of it's raining because every single drop that hits the windscreen will be casting this kind of shadow. That's embrace and fold wings. So these are the two things, the expansion and contraction of the energy, while keeping the physical chillicity on. I mean, that's a level 1, 2, 3 type of technique, keeping the physical chillicity on. Here we're talking about level 4. But the containment on your energy when you use those techniques in the spirit dance behaves exactly like those droplets on the windscreen or like those deep oceanic waves. And this is why actually just practicing these two together, even if you're not a martial artist, can make you a fairly dangerous person, because you practice this a lot. This thing has a lot of power in it, just a huge amount of power. So even if you didn't know what you were doing, just throwing that power into somebody might cause them a bit of a problem when you get really good at it, because it is a huge amount of energy. We talked about this, we've been talking about this concept for a while now. A friend of mine, Bernard, who is one of my long-standing shamanism students, disciples, followers, I don't know what you want to call them, friends. Shamanism, my long-standing shamanism friend. He came up with this idea that, trying to explain why it seems like people kind of quote unquote fight with spirit dance. Shamans can fight with it. And they don't at all. But what he came up with was a brilliant phrase, which I really like, which is, you don't fight with it, but it does look after you. And I think that's such a great way to understand spirit dance. One of the things I've also noted with spirit dance, which is, again, this learning from nature thing, is it doesn't stop you tripping up. It just stops you falling down. That's kind of the way that it works. And it's wonderful for this type of thing. So for instance, on the Lonesome Grove, we did a lot of stuff that to the uninitiated observer might have looked when we're doing it with just like shaman partner dance with just two people, it might have looked a bit like martial arts. But then if they came along a bit later and they saw 6 people all in a sort of twisted knot, it looked like that kids' game Twister, it's still doing it with this continuous flow and change of energy, then they might not have thought it was martial arts, So who knows? But it's best not to care about things like that when you shaman. As I've said before, worrying about what people think of you is one of the main things that's going to kill your progress as a shaman.
So was the exercise more to just sort of flow and react to the other person?
Exactly. To with lots of ebbs and flows, and we were using the content from the course in a combined shamanic dance, and so learning from nature, learning from the changes within nature, you might be reacting to the movements of the leaves of a tree, the movements of the wind, the movements of the water, but
or your partner.
But your partner is also part of nature. And if they're likewise reacting to what's going on in the natural environment, then that's wonderful, because you're creating a more complex weave and a more engaged weave than you ever could as an individual. And, the whole point of shamanism, this is the nectar ultimately to dissolve within nature. That's the whole point of it. So that's a wateristic explanation of Tiralt and Haftas. If we just start going through these 10 techniques in order, the next one naturally comes out of that. You'll know yourself when you start doing the embrace and the fold wings, and say you're just doing it, with moving off to the left, and then you switch back and you move off to the right, and vice versa. You naturally find as you move between the embrace and fold wings, energy containment, let's call them energy containment positions, dynamically. Naturally, there's this kind of smaller kind of whirlpool or vortex appears and this is Ergulig in Mongol. Anyone who's seen the Tillin exercise will know what I'm talking about. You've got Haftas folded wings, Tiralt embrace, and then naturally as you're turning, that circle just sort of starts to come out, and you see this all over the place. I've seen this in South American spirit dance. I've seen this in Malay spirit dance. I've seen it in Japanese spirit dance. I've seen it in, it's not Japanese spirit dance. It's shamanic spirit dance from Japan. I've seen it in Mongol, Siberia. This natural vortex that occurs when you maintain physical chillicity, and then that vortex then extends out into other things. That is exactly like a whirlpool. It's the way the energy moves in that vortex, in that Ergulig in Mongol vortex, in the central part of the driving force behind Tillin. That's what we're calling the third technique, the whirlpool. But my point here is that, and I'm talking about a real whirlpool in the water where you see sometimes like in a dam where you have one of these sinkholes, or in going down what do they call it, the Coriolis effect or something, when it goes down the plug hole and it starts, because of the spin of the earth, it starts going round in a spiral. This is the third one, the third technique that we picked out. So you got the oceanic wave thing going on with the expansion and contraction, the expansion on the outside of the wave and the contraction on the center piece of the wave, which makes that sort of deep oceanic powerful movement that the ocean has. Mm-hmm. Turning into this naturally turning into this whirlpool type of effect, and you get it. We're talking about the language of air or the language of the wind. You see that's in that what tornadoes are and storm systems. They start because of the rotation of the planet. Cyclones, those type of movements that you also get it with the clouds in the air, and you see these great pictures of the Earth from space with these whirlpools. They form naturally out of these natural energy changes that go on because of the nature of nature, and you see them all over the place.
Yeah, and you see the way you're describing these naturally reminds me of the 8 energies that we've talked about quite a few times, the 8 core energies that essentially make up how the world works.
Squall and Gaia.
Squall and Gaia. We talk about these quite often, but a lot of people will know them as the 8 trigrams. Yeah. I think we have talked about them in some form of depth in this podcast, right?
We have, yeah. And I think we can talk about them anyway, because the people who should be listening to this episode and haven't taken, if anyone hasn't taken my advice and gone back to episode 1, I apologize profusely. I think we can just talk about them now. We know we have a lot of knowledgeable patrons. We know we have patrons whose spirit dance is getting on for what I would call pretty good these days. So I think we can just talk about them. So yes, Squall and Gaia. Squall is very prominent in the Haftas and the Teirilt, the embrace and fold wings movement, the flux between those two things. And Gaia is very prominent in the vortex, the whirlpool,
the circular
movement, the
spiraling nature.
Yes, just a key point on that one. Incidentally, although the whirlpool naturally forms out of other things, it does in spirit dance, it does in the clouds, and it does in the water. It naturally forms out of other elements. It then becomes a driver for further changes within the energy pattern. So even though it forms secondarily out of other energy changes, actually it then becomes a driver of further energy changes. So it's really, really important to understand. The whirlpool battery, if you like, of what we do is it. I can't imagine a spirit dance that's properly integrated with nature that doesn't have this change in it. And the whirlpool is much more strongly Gaia. But if you think about embrace and fold wings as embodying to a greater extent the Squall aspect, and the whirlpool to a greater extent the Gaia aspect, but both have both, right? They're both.
Yeah.
It's about the preponderance of which changes in each. So I think taking those three things as our first three techniques hits a very, very fundamental note in spirit dance. It's impossible, and I have tried, it's impossible just to single out one energy change and say, here is a technique that practices this one energy change, and we only need 8 techniques, and then we're sorted. I'm afraid not. Do you know how many times I've tried to come up with something like that? That's not happening. Yeah. But what we can
Dermot,
do...
You just said three things. What's the third? I've got the compress and they expand with the rhythm, and I've got the spiraling.
Because the embrace is the first. And if
embrace.
You go back to
right.
Chalicia, the reason it's not separate, I mean, you could call the embrace and the fold wings, you could call it one thing and call it one technique, but then you'd be missing out on the Teirilt practice. You'd be missing out on those, level 1, level 2 AMSCA stuff. That's good for by itself without the whole fold wings thing. Yes, So that's why we have them as 2 separate techniques rather than just calling the whole thing one technique. That's the reason, because embrace is really, really useful in level 1 and level 2. That's probably where fold wings is as well, but it's using that at level 1 and level 2 is a more advanced kind of thing. Whereas embrace is the kind of, Teirilt is the kind of thing that beginners want to be doing with level 1 and level 2.
Yeah, and just for reference, that's the palms open, embracing position, very much like the girl, the woman on our artwork, right?
Yeah, it's the most famous image for the podcast, right?
Yes.
Unfortunately, not done particularly well, but it gets the idea over.
Gets the idea.
Not as bad as Julie Andrews in The Sound of Music, but not that her singing is bad. A big fan of Julie Andrews singing. Anyway, so number 4, what would that be? So remember, we've got these big oceanic type of waves, very powerful, where this kind of real power comes from in spirit dance. Then if you look at, do you remember where we used to practice up by what was that reservoir? Blackmorefoot Reservoir?
Blackmorefoot Reservoir,
yeah. We used to practice up there, and sometimes because it's a reservoir, it's quite flat. And when the wind's blowing, you don't get these sort of big kind of, beefy waves you get out in the North Sea or somewhere like that. It's little ripples on the top. Yeah. And this is number 4. So this is Dolkon in Mongol. And it has more of a floating up and down. And this is very useful for introducing interactions with spirit dance, with things external to yourself. So for instance, what I was talking about with a branch on a tree, the wind is moving the branch, and you, for instance, just put your fingertips on the branch while you're doing your spirit dance, and as the branch moves up, your hand's moving up with it, and as the branch moves down, or back and forwards or whatever, and your hand, the fingertips are just tracing. They're not resisting the branch in any way, and they're not breaking contact with it. They're just tracing its movement. And, the better at it you are, the further up the branch you can go. I mean, away from the trunk of the tree, yeah? If you're right
now,
out
we
on the tip of the
explored
tree.
that technique in a lot of detail back when we were looking at level 2 techniques, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So go back to the level 2 techniques if you want to listen to a whole episode on that.
So what we did at the Grove where we're testing this content out is we had some partner work using the same technique. So your partner's 2 arms, the backs of their hands, are your tree branches when you're spirit dancing with a partner. And it's just following their motion. They're following your motion. And so we use the same ripples technique, Dolkon, in introducing the idea of partner spirit dance. And the idea is that neither one person resists the other person, and neither one person breaks contact with the other person. But the key thing is neither person ever stops moving. That includes the whole body, right? So because you're not allowed to stop moving under the rules of this sort of introduction to partner spirit dance with another shaman, because you're not allowed to stop moving and you have to keep the energy flow going, that makes that all very much more interesting than because the easiest way to do that is both of you immediately stop moving, right? And then you're fulfilling the requirement not to break contact. But so if you look at some of the photos in the patrons area, you can see the results of what we're talking about. It's very, very interesting. It's very enlightenment. It's a real skill, and you could see I'm sure the less experienced people won't mind me saying that you could see the skill level of some of our patrons shining through when we were doing that. It's one of those things where you can, as I said, can somebody do spirit dance? Or they're just imagining they can do it? We talked about this early on the podcast, the imagination trap. Can they really do it? Well, doing that kind of ripples is technique number 4. Spirit dancing with an opponent, not an opponent, let's call it a shamanic partner. There can be an opponent, if you get to a high level with shamanism, shamans can test each other. As I said, shamanism should also be testable, right? They can test each other. So you can immediately see who has skill, who can really do it. And, all of our patrons there were somewhat experienced. There was no one who was a complete beginner. But you could easily judge skill levels in that type of technique from doing it, and so this is what I mean by shamanism has to be testable. And another thing, I'll shout out to Rambi and Emily, who a while ago, 2 of our awesome patrons, who I went up to we did the solstice, or was it the equinox on Bodmin Moor, and it doesn't really matter what the event was. The point is, we went up to Stone Circle and we started spirit dancing in there, and there were some other people. There doing a bit of spirit dance in the Stone Circle. We, you could immediately see the difference in level, in ability. But if you were in that other kind of shamanism where there's no testing, there's no reality, if you're imagining things, then you wouldn't know. You could do any kind of weird movements, and you did see some weird movements going on, and with lots of Tyrak and all this kind of stuff. You can dress up any way you want, but this is where it comes down to real shamanism. Can you do it or not? Can you really do it? And this ripples dance that's what we're going to call it. I think we'll call it the ripples dance.
The ripple dance.
The ripple dance, yeah. This ripple dance is a great way to see what we were talking about when we said shamanism is testable. Either if you can't do it, it's immediately apparent. Or if you're not very good at it, or if you're moderately good at it, or if you're very good at it, it's immediately apparent in ripple dance. So I think it's quite a good one. And this is just the 4th technique that we're introducing. Obviously, it doesn't have to be a person that you dance with. Dance with anything, a tree or whatever you like. And also the water. Ripple dance can be done with real ripples. You go out in the sea You got your arms on top of the waves and you're ripple dancing with the waves. Great skill set. Great skill set. So that's
I think that's the kind of thing that you do play with when you're a kid as well. I remember doing that as a kid. Very much. Just like laying your hands over the ripples of the water and letting it guide you and stuff. It's kind of like I mean, you don't know what you're doing, obviously, as a kid, but it's a bit of a game that you can.
And then society sucks it all out of you, doesn't it? It sucks you dry as you get older. And you get, kids are masters of this stuff. I mean, very young children, absolute masters of this stuff. So, next one. What we said is we're not going to use any names of animals that we're going to use as spirit animals in the names of the Amabella style names of the 10 techniques. But it's okay to use animals that we're not going to use. So the next technique is called fishtails. And this is like the waves that roll in and are amplified by a shallowing beach. I don't know if you know what I mean. You know, the wave has a certain amount of amplitude when it's out at sea, but when it rolls into the beach, that's getting the water's getting shallower and shallower and shallower. The wave gets pushed upwards, and then it shoots through. Especially if it's one of those deep oceanic waves that managed to hit the beach, it shoots through. There's like a shoot through, so there's a raising, an expansion on the shallowing beach. The energy is raising up. It's becoming more apparent. When you see it out at sea, it doesn't seem like very much, but when it comes up on the beach, it gets like, it rises up. I wouldn't say like a monster, but, like Godzilla coming out of the water or something, but it sort of expands and becomes more prominent. And that rise then is followed by a shoot through where the beach gets so low that the wave collapses under its own weight and it shoots through. And it doesn't collapse under its own weight. If it's sufficiently powerful, it just keeps shooting through, keeps going. This is exactly what a tsunami is like. I don't know if you saw the videos of some of the tsunamis, for instance, the one that hit the Fukushima nuclear reactor in Japan.
Horrendous. It's awe-inspiring.
These are not the waves that break in a pretty kind of way on the beach, and make a nice sound. These are scary things. So this fishtails movement, the reason it's called fishtails is just your fingers look a bit like the tails of fish when you're doing this technique. As they, fish shoals turning in the water. But actually, this is the kind of energy that tsunami uses. It's that build, that raise up, and then the shoot through. That's the fifth technique that we're teaching on the course. And again, can be very, very dangerous. The next one is that vortex. When you go down, I don't know if you noticed in water, but there are actually at least two types of vortices. There's like the effect of water going down a plug hole or a sinkhole, like, in those reservoirs where they have the sort of overflow and it's a big pipe out the thing and it all goes down like that and it can start spiraling around like a whirlpool.
Like a huge bath plug.
But then sometimes if you see a water that's turning very rapidly in a cylinder, turning around very, very rapidly in a cylinder, you get a stretching of that whirlpool into a very, very tight, thin vortex. You know what I mean? So it's, I guess, the difference like between a hurricane, which would be the number 3. It's got this, the hurricane's got an eye, right? The eye of the hurricane, where things tend to be in the center, within the containment, things can be very calm, even though the outer surface of the whirlpool, the hurricane, is quite powerful and could be doing some very energetic stuff within the middle as a calm. But as that gets stretched out, the water column becomes taller. It turns into a very tight vortex where there is not really any central eye anymore. And this is like the difference between a tornado and a hurricane. Yeah. The coiling, and this is what we're calling this one, coiling, we were calling that lo in Mongol, but coiling, that has cultural implications. You have to understand the cultural implications to understand it. But we said we're going to use Amabella style names for these things, so we'll just call it coiling. It creates a very, very tight, stretched vortex. And again, that the length of that vortex, as you pursue your energy dance, it can be quite contained, but then it can be stretched right out. And that sort of tends to narrow the vortex it tends to narrow the whirlpool of your energy, if you like. And that's a really interesting change. Once you've learned a few basic techniques, that's a really, really interesting change to roll in with them within your spirit dance. What we're doing with this course is we get a couple of techniques, say embrace and fold wings, and then we teach people how to put them together in different patterns and how to spontaneously, because this is all going with no scripting in this stuff. If scripting equals not spirit dance, to spontaneously put these things together, these techniques together in different, increasingly complex patterns. So this would be the level 3 into level 4 stuff. Remember, this is just to hasten to add, this is not the be all and end all of what we're doing here. There's a reason to all of this, which is the level 5, level 6 stuff. But at this point in time, we're creating these vortices, these different changing patterns. So this coiling is a very, very interesting one. And when you stretch that vortex out with your energy, that vortex can take within itself, you can get a contraction and expansion of the thread of the vortex. So you've got the thread of the energy going round and round to create the vortex, but within the thread, the vortex itself, you got this compression. You can get this compression and expansion of the energy. You can have swirls, you can have bends, you can have taking it around the corner, turning that vortex over on itself. I'm doing a whole bunch of arm movements, and body movements, but I'm just sat in my chair on a podcast. Yeah. But anyway, so maybe what I should do is just film myself recording this podcast so that people see what I'm talking about. But they will on the course anyway. So that adds, so technique number 6 out of 10 is where some real complexity starts to get added. And so for the word complexity, also read the word interestingness gets to get added into the mix. They can free link, they can free mix, embrace and fold wings. Then they put the whirlpool in as a kind of driver, a symptom and a driver of within the weave. And then you put the ripples in, so you get a lot of changeability, and then the ability to raise up with the energy and shoot through with it. That's your first 5 techniques. There's quite a lot of variety there. But now you want to thread them all together in a different way. It's not just swapping from one to the other. It's also introducing a new flavor into all of them. And that's what this technique number 6, coiling, is all about. Any one of those 5 or any 2 of those 5 can be threaded together simultaneously with the coiling energy. And so that's what the 6th technique in the series is going to be, like that vortex of water.
Nice. So it's like bringing all of the techniques together and being able to thread them together using specifically the coiling of the body, and the coiling creates that the almost like I'm hesitant to say spiraling one technique into the other, because that's also
but that is what happens. That is what happens. But it's not spiraling the techniques; it's spiraling the energy within the techniques into each other. That's the idea. Yeah. So. And you can see, put them some thought, not just into what the 10 techniques are, but also to the order in which we're going to introduce them in this course. And then the next thing is just what we're all familiar with when we say waves, especially if you're from Cornwall with our 100+ beaches. You go down the beach, they're the waves that break on the beach. That's breaking waves. So we're literally calling it breaking waves. These are the waves that roll up on the beach and they roll over on themselves and they sort of fall on the beach with a nice sound. That sounds wonderful. And, often I'll go out and stand in the surf and do my spirit dance there, and driven by the waves. This is the language of water. The language of water I'm taking through my ears as I do any other language. But it's not just that. I've got the feel on my legs and my hands, and also the effect it has in the air and the atmosphere and all of that kind of stuff.
Gosh, I remember doing this as a kid, Damon. I used to
exactly.
just be in the water and feel those currents and just buffeting you this way and that way. It's super, super interesting how you do this stuff as a kid.
So technique number 7, it's just like the real waves. It's a wonderful technique. It's a lot of fun. It does introduce the idea of switchback, what I call switchback in the energy patterns. So basically where you take the energy one way and then you suddenly switch it back with a little loop or coil and then go off in another direction with it. That's the rolling over of the wave, right? Just before it breaks. So that's number 7. It's a lot of fun to do that technique. And so, just like the waves are nice, that technique is nice. And then, compared to, for instance, a tsunami, then the next one is the next aspect. That's the breaking waves. That's the splash. The breaking waves then move into splashing. Now, we've got two choices for the name for this. Some would call it splashing, and it makes a lot of Armabella style sense to call it splashing because it's more understandable. But on the other hand, the Mongolian name for this thing is way more interesting. So rather than using the actual Mongol name for it, which is Yastmelhi, what I sort of thought we could just give it an Armabella style name that sounded a bit esoteric rather than exoteric. Anyway, bone-covered frog. That's what we're going to call it. Working title anyway.
Bone-covered frog.
It's such a cool name. That's Yastmelhi.
It is cool, but it might need some explaining, that one.
Yeah. So the explanation is quite simple, really. It's actually, we said we weren't going to put any animal names, and you can do any animal spirit with this technique, but it has been associated with turtle or turtles for a very long time. And so and I remember, shout out to our patron Ricard, I remember doing this in the park with him in Stockholm. Very fond memory on a lovely day. I had a lot of fun doing that, mate, if you're listening, which probably might be. So this movement is, so obviously in Mongolia, there's no turtles. There's a concept of turtles, right? Because there is the whole Chinese influence on Mongolia, and Chinese know what turtles are, But there's not a lot of lakes in Mongolia, and those lakes, I wouldn't like to be a turtle in one of those lakes, the ones that there are. I'm talking about temperature-wise. So going back in the day, they'd never seen a turtle, had they? But they had seen a frog, and they saw this thing that looks a bit like a frog with bone, like a bony shell over it, so hence bone-covered frog, and it sounds so shamanistic that I think we're probably going to stick with it as the English name, bone-covered frog. And again, we're not using a frog as a spirit animal, so then I don't think there's any harm in it. But this is splashing. So this is where you take the energy pattern, whichever way it's been going, and you switch back or roll over, and then there's just a sort of splash, little bit of Tyrak in it, not excessive, a little bit of Tyrak, where the energy sort of dissipates itself into a different form, into a cloud. Like the spray off the waves, that kind of thing, dissipates itself. And also the sound, And if you're good enough at it, you can make a sound doing it, And once you get the energy up, So, especially if you're using like a drum or a staff or something like that when you're doing it. Yeah. So that's the 8th one, bone-covered frog. And then the next one is like this sort of rapidly changing. So anybody who's been up to Tintagel with me, Graham will know this. He's been up there with me. When you get down to the sort of place that's down at the bottom of the island or the promontory, and there's like this cove that comes in, and there's rocks, and the water in there is very, very powerful, and it moves into the caves, like the famous Merlin's Cave at high tide. And it moves in with a lot of power into those places. And also there's lots of rocks and like little inlets and stuff like that. And it comes in as big waves, but then the complexity of the rocks around it tend to rapidly change the nature of that power. They don't kill the power. They rapidly change its nature in various weird and wonderful ways. And it goes from sort of simple to complex very, very rapidly. And so we've got this thing we're calling fan feathers, technique number 9. This, again, it's just what your hands look like when you're doing it. It's just a figurative thing. It's got nothing to do with the technique, really. We'd maybe come up with a better name for it. But this is like rapidly changing power. So the power draws in everywhere one way, suddenly switch backs, then rolls over the top, sweeps underneath, and often you'll put a turn in your spirit dance as you're doing that. So it's really about heavy power turning into complex power, and then rejoining again out of it. And I think we talked about this on a previous podcast, maybe a level 3 or level 4 podcast, where sometimes threads of the main thread of the dance can split apart into multiple threads and then coalesce back together again into a single thread that has a slightly different flavor or character to what came in. But again, this one tends to be quite powerful. You could do somebody an injury with it, even though it's not for fighting. So that's the 9th technique that was figured out. And then the 10th one, it was so hard because there were so many techniques. But the 10th one is the water just going over the edge, It's the waterfall. We're calling it swoop down, but it's the waterfall. where water just it has a lot of power. It's moving around with torrent. So in terms of the 8 changes that we talked about, torrent, that's the broken baseline, solid midline, broken top line, yin, yang, yin, when you're reading up from the baseline. It goes over with a lot of torrent, and then it's a plunge, and it's sort of the power accelerates in the motion, a plunge, but it also at the same time it's heavy. It changes from heavy to light. We talked about that on Ashqui. There's a video already on the patrons area that already talks about this change from heavy to light and from light to heavy, but that's all in one. It's Ashqui. It's aspects of physical chillicity. It's kind of heaviness in lightness and lightness and heaviness. And the water, the character of the energy in the water makes that change as the plunge happens. And so that's what this technique is one of many that can demonstrate this type of a change in nature. And that is the 10th technique, and that's our complete 10 techniques. So this is how it works. You learn technique 1, then you learn technique 2. You then learn to mix together technique 1 and technique 2 spontaneously, learn the movement so that you can move around your grove wherever you're practicing in among the woods.
Yeah, and that forms a foundation.
Finds a foundation. And then gradually we add in another technique into that mix. We add in the whirlpool. Yep. We can't really not add in the whirlpool because it kind of adds itself in. Once somebody becomes good at those two, they start doing the whirlpool, whether you tell them to or not. That adds itself in. And then once the whirlpool's in there, then you start adding the ripples, then you start adding the fishtails, then the coiling can come in. Maybe you do have to point that out because it is an energy change that goes on within nature. And the whole tight vortex thing, and it would be one that you could miss if you weren't aware of it. And then we get to put the breaking waves in. But every one of these, so you get good at 1 and 2, and then you get good at 3 mixed in with 1 and 2, and then you get 4. You get good at 4 mixed in with 1, 2, and 3, and that's how we progress with this course. It's not like we do 1 isolation, then we do 2, then we do 3. It's not like that at all. Yeah. So by the time you get to the end of this, you can do spirit dance with mixture of all 10. Hopefully you get to the point where you can do that in a state of chillicity, maintaining the physical chillicity, and then the next course will be doing all of that, flavoring it with a bear spirit. Flavoring it with a spirit.
Let me clarify in my mind what these 10 techniques are, and I'm going to do it in a Joe style question. So
go for it, mate.
Basically, you've got 10 techniques, and these 10 techniques reflect because we've already talked about the 8 energy changes in quite a lot of depth.
Yes.
And so these 10 techniques are a way to learn the 8 energy changes in a more structured way.
Exactly. So Miki did this years ago. I mean, we're talking about 1830s, even as back as far as the 1830s. She picked out there's this thing called kagura in Japanese tradition. It means the divine music. This is like thinking about the universe, the energy changes on the universe, different aspects, commonly occurring energy patterns within the energy changes in the universe as musical instruments. And so she called this the kagura, the divine music. And there were 8 plus 2, which made 10. The 8 were what we call about the 8 energy changes. But then the extra 2 were the sort of seeds of things. Yeah. Tane and Nawashiro, Tane being like the seed, and Tane and Nawashiro being like the plot in which the seed is germinated or the seed grows, the nurturing aspect of nature and the creative aspect of nature put together. And she took those out as another 2, which altogether made 10. And it's called the Juzen no Shugo, that pattern in Japanese. But what's very interesting is that Shugo just means the things that give rise to things within nature. But Juzen is a very interesting term because Ju literally means 10. It means 10 things. But actually, Juzen as a word taken by itself in Japanese means complete. Yeah. So when you have Juzen, you have complete things. Yeah. And so what we're doing with these 10 techniques is a bit like what Miki did with her kagura spirit dance, is we are coming up with 10 things, 10 techniques that cover off pretty much all of the main energy changes that go on. I mean, and we're going through probably going to go through at least 64 energy changes, probably more on this podcast. And are all of those 64 embodied within these things? Well, yes, I would say they are. Not necessarily very prominently in some cases, but the vast majority will be covered by just these 10, especially, and when you start mixing in the animal flavor, the animal spirits within these 10, then for sure all 64 or more will be covered in terms of energy changes. Once you got through my ever-increasing list, when it needs to be cut down, list of animals.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds amazing. And I'll be looking forward to diving into that as well.
And I think because our tribe are far-flung, I think it's going to be a great thing for us all to talk about and interact with each other at a distance, because it'll give us all some sort of commonality to
a structure.
Ask questions about,
a structure,
exactly.
a less overwhelming structure.
Yeah, I think once you take all those animals in, it's pretty overwhelming, mate. But without the animals, a less overwhelming structure.
Well, I mean, a less overwhelming structure, a less overwhelming experience than this podcast.
Yeah,
because,
and when
you can just go through them and
and
we're going to be there
exactly. And how I used to teach spirit dance, it's like this is here now. Let's do this, which is how I learned from my teachers. Here now, let's do this, and it's never the same. It's never the same thing with me. So it's because the sort of torsional team thing is important in shamanism, right? But it's not necessarily the easiest way for anybody to learn what we're doing. So this is what we're trying to do with this course. We're trying to make it understandable and make a progression for people. Not the only progression. There could be loads of other progressions, but a progression that people could go through to get to quite a good place with their spirit dance. That's the idea.
Nice. Right then. Well, anything else to add, Damon, or should we leave it there?
No, I'm all good, mate.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for listening. Hope you've enjoyed this one. And we will, of course, see you in the next one. Cheers.
Thank you very much, guys.
Oh, before we go, by the way, remember you can support us on Patreon by going to patreon.com/wovenenergy. And if you go over there, you're able to get all sorts of extra bits and bobs, but it's all laid out for you. So if you want to support us, head over there. Cheers. We'll see you in the next one.
All the best.